Let me say thank you to the Mayor of Riga and welcome to the autumn stage of the Riga conference. For those who are exiting now the main spring stage on the ground floor, I can tell that this is a stage on the -1 floor, so you need to go one floor down. And I know it's a trek now on a Friday night when the dinner is being served on the ground floor. However, the dinner will be there for quite some time. So you will have time to both attend this session and then the dinner, so please do come, because this is a session about the cybersecurity and data governance at the times of war. My name is Kirill Sukhotskiy. I'm the Regional Director for Europe at RFERL. I'm based in Prague, but we are now opening a big Russia-focused hub here in Riga. And we will be talking about the cyber threat and cybersecurity during this war in Ukraine. And as much as the war in Ukraine at times seems like a conventional war, with tanks crossing the terrain, with Ukrainian soldiers hunkering in trenches like it is World War I, like the bombs falling on Ukrainian city like it's the Blitz in London in the World War II, still this war is different. And to a various degree on both sides, it's information and data that drive many decisions. Cyber threat became a national security threat. Cybersecurity became a vital point. What lessons have we learned from this war in Ukraine? And what do we expect to come next? So at this panel, I'm joined by three distinguished guests. Līga Rozentāle from Microsoft, who is the Senior Director for the EU Cybersecurity. Welcome. Jeffrey Edmonds, who is the National Security Strategist and Senior Analyst at the Center for New American Security and former Director for Russia at the National Security Council. Welcome, Jeffrey. And joining us online from Warsaw, Marta Musidłowska, Digital Economy Analyst at Instrad Foundation in Poland. Thank you for joining us, Marta. Thank you to all the panelists. So I will start, Līga. Microsoft is a huge digital giant. What was your response to the Ukraine crisis, to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think we can start looking at how Microsoft has been cooperating with Ukraine and states far in advance of the war. So ever since 2018, we have been tracking nation states and their activity in cyberspace and notifying countries when we see a nation state attack. So we had been doing that with Ukraine already for several years, but these are also attacks that are based on cloud adoption. Ukraine's government did not use cloud services at the time of the war, but we could at least have visibility of adjunct services that were using cloud services. So already in the last year, we saw increases of attacks. The attacks are increasing on critical infrastructures, on NGOs, on education services, and these attacks were quite apparent. We had developed closer and closer cooperation with Ukraine to notify of these attacks, but there were significant attacks, of course, in February. And as those attacks started, we immediately started to work with Ukraine on a continuous basis. We established very tight cooperation so that we could have real-time experts. We worked with governments who are very involved with what was going on, and we established excellent communication so that we can give them as much information as possible. But there was a big restriction for what we could do for the Ukrainian government. They had a national law which restricted data from exiting Ukraine. They had a national data center. Their information was sitting, and it was under, territorial integrity became a significant factor in the data of the Ukrainian government. So on March 16th, in the middle of a war, they went through parliament, an act so that data can exit the country. Immediately, Microsoft worked to have cloud adoption for as many ministries as possible. I think now we serve 17 out of 20 ministries approximately to have all that data exported outside of Ukraine so that there would be resilience of government services to the maximum extent. And this has continued until now. and Microsoft has been working endlessly to provide all digital services that Ukraine needs to defend its country, to provide continuity, and to provide that resilience. And that's been extremely essential, along with many other tech companies. So in order to have the entire ecosystem of digital infrastructure, there has been excessive commitments from many tech companies, not only Microsoft. So, but to this point, I think we've contributed about 280 million euros of products and services to Ukraine for free to be able to keep up that effort, and that's a small part of what Ukraine needs. So that's how we've been involved until now. Would you like me to go on?
But what do you think? It's very interesting how we all expected cyber attacks against Ukraine. We all expected in the run-up to the war, and actually in the first days of the war, that those cyber attacks could cripple Ukraine. Why do you think that hasn't happened?
I think there's many reasons. There are ongoing attacks, but we have already had, before the war, established the good connections to be able to warn and to mitigate those attacks and to address them as fast as possible, which we can do if we have, the maximum services that Microsoft can provide. That is not going to be the solution to every single attack. We've seen significant attacks that have been mitigated with the combination of intelligence from the private sector and from governments together. And by doing so, it has been at least mitigated to the point where it hasn't had significant implications. However, there have been, we've released 2 different reports that have really looked at how the cyber attacks have been combined with disinformation attacks, have been combined with kinetic attacks, and that there's a significant cooperation between espionage, influence operations, cyber attacks, and kinetic attacks that are very strongly coordinated and have to be taken into consideration for all the defenses of Ukraine. And there's definitely lessons learned how other countries need to address these issues in tandem.
Yeah, we'll talk about those lessons just in a second, in a moment. Jeffrey, were you surprised that Ukraine was able, to a large extent, to withstand that cyber threat and withstand the attacks? So, again, I remember we were talking about, Russia has weaponized hacking, so we all expected the power system to be completely destroyed by those hacking efforts, and now Russians were not able to do that, and they are trying now to do this with conventional weapons rather than with cyberfare. So, were you surprised? And what do you think the security and military community learned from Ukraine? And obviously, everybody was surprised about how this war panned out. But to what extent, that surprise was down to that resilience on the cyber front from Ukraine?
Right. So, Russian failures in Ukraine have been pretty shocking. And that goes for regular conventional operations, but also their management of information broadly. And when you think about it, the Russian military has spent a lot of time thinking about information warfare, under which you would have cyber, electronic warfare, releasing people's emails. All of that fits under a broad umbrella in Russian thinking, the psychological and the technical aspects of information warfare. And this was really kind of an initiative after the Georgia War. Really, even the Soviet Army was, I wrote this article called "The Bear is Getting Glasses," because during the Cold War, the Soviet Army couldn't see very well, right? Couldn't manage information very well. If it got a hold of you, it could inflict a lot of damage, but didn't see very well. And then there were tremendous efforts on the Russian military's part to better manage information broadly, whether that's psychological warfare, whether that's managing battlefield information dominance, something they've talked a lot about. There was a lot of effort put into that, both money, a lot of very intricate articles that kind of revealed a very complex view of how information works. There's this talk of on the battlefield anyway, disorganizing troops, and it's everything from cyber attacks against or planting information that soldiers can see that misleads them about how the war is going, to electronic warfare, to anti-space efforts. And so you have this body of information, and all of us, I don't know a single person that was like, the Russians really haven't made progress in this area. And this is where a lot of us were wrong, right? Their ability to manage information has been pretty abysmal. They did launch cyber attacks. I put a plug-in for Riga's reports
Jeffrey,
online.
Is it because they didn't have the knowledge, or they were too arrogant?
So I think the problem that Russians are having, and it's not just in information, I mean, there's two things. There's two buckets. When you look at Russian failures, there are those failures that are contingent to the way the Russian military has been employed. Telling your military commanders they can take Kyiv in 72 hours is a technique. It's not a very good technique, right? The other side of that are the inherent weaknesses in the Russian military that we didn't know about. And I think, to your point, what they have not been able to do is scale, right? They can't manage digital information to conduct large aerospace campaigns, right? That's one of the reasons their Air Force isn't very active. And while they may launch cyber attacks and try to, from a Russian perspective, disorganize and create chaos within the Ukrainian government, they can't pair that at the operational level to take advantage of that, right? And so in many ways, the Ukrainians have obviously done incredibly well, I think, in the information sphere and on the ground. But the other part of this is the Russian military just hasn't been able to scale up to the type of war that they've engaged in.
Do you think they're learning?
I'm sorry?
Do you think they're learning as the war progresses?
Some. Things like managing command and control, for example, is something they've improved somewhat. In the beginning of the war, command and control was managed 3 different people. One of the reasons they couldn't, in a certain sense, try to gain that information dominance on the battlefield. And since they've solidified in the East and kind of simplified their command and control, that's, I think, led to some better information management on their part. But then you see things like the Kharkiv counteroffensive. It was no secret the Ukrainian troops were massing opposite Kharkiv, and the Russians knew that. All of the military analysts and bloggers in Russia saw this happening, yet the Russians couldn't capitalize on that and actually adjust to meet that counteroffensive. And so I do think they're going to learn. It might take some time, though, because the initial failures were so bad, and the Russian military is in such a bad state right now that I don't think it's in a position to just kind of sit back and think about, well, what lessons have we learned?
Marta, let me come back to you and let me kind of reflect and continue on something that Līga said about the initial obstacles at the beginning of the war, when it was issues actually related to digital sovereignty, where Ukraine asserted the right that some data could not leave the country. So, we see those digital sovereignty issues playing in various ways in various sectors. How do you see that issue, that we can overcome those issues during the times of war, as Microsoft helped to do? But what are the ways to gather those data in a more secure way that does not pose those digital sovereignty issues, that the country nation states can be secure digitally, but at the same time cooperate with each other and solve the issues together?
First of all, I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
And I'm very happy that although I'm in a different place, I can still join your discussion. And first, I would like to say that we are, as you mentioned, we are all talking about data and how important it is to secure them. But recently, I heard a really interesting view regarding the fact that data is just a buzzword itself. And it doesn't mean anything that it's shredded, and they are not important when they are kind of separated, but altogether they are really valuable, right? And how we manage them is more important. And many people say that data is the new oil, but it's not a new oil at all. Data are more like air. They are like a resource that exists in the human environment, let's say, or like they are made by humans or with some other devices, but they are not competitive in consumption and other resources, and that's why this is certainly the advantage. But what is the new oil for certainly is the data management, as you said, the data governance and things what we do with that, because that's our information, it's our knowledge. So I really think that here we have to change somehow our way of how we perceive that, because we are talking about how to make Ukrainians' data secure from Russians, but we are not thinking about what kind of data we have right now during the war and how we can actually use them for better security, for maybe better AI or maybe better new technologies in different ways, right? Because they might be used in war, right? And they might be used for civilians. And when we will manage them properly with proper models, that might make certain decisions quicker and more accurate. So when it comes to models that we with Instrat were talking about, when we prepared a pilotage kind of a pilot for Poland, it was for medical data and agricultural data, but I think it might be used also here. It's called kind of public data commons. So not everyone has an access, of course. It's not like open data, because we already know that Ukraine is very good in opening data, but it's more like giving an access, so not everyone has it. And it's governed by certain institutions. So it can be governed by public institution or by universities or by, I don't know, any other national academy, let's say. And the basic is that you can use it for certain sector, as I said, for medical or agriculture, or for different types of data, for example, for personal or non-personal. And the main concept is that, first of all, MIT made this idea to move algorithm to data, so that data are always in their secure environment. So if someone wants to use this data for a certain purpose, for certain AI, they have to send the algorithm to the base, to this public data commons, as I said. Then someone is checking this algorithm, if it's secure or not. And then maybe the algorithm is operating on the data within this base, this secure place. And then the results are turning back to the person. Then there are another additional safeguards that can be adopted to prevent data from flowing out of another party using, for example, homomorphic encryption, which involves operating on encrypted data without decrypting it, or how to, for example, make sure that who is taking the access. It can be, of course, strengthened by blockchain technology, and it can be here served as registry of permissions granted. So we always know who, for example, sent us the algorithm, who is getting the results. And I really also liked what you said about Microsoft with it, because I was also reading a little bit about that, and I also know that here it's very important for Ukraine, for sure, to make sure that their servers are outside of Ukraine, right? Because, and they have the decentralize it. For example, there are certain servers in Poland right now, because, and also they are on Microsoft, as I know. And there is a need to kind of cooperate in that regard. So
thank you, Marta. I will just turn to Līga here, because that's one of the digital vulnerabilities that that were identified in the service and physical location. What else have we learned? So Jeffrey was talking about Russian vulnerabilities, but obviously there were Ukrainian vulnerabilities too. So what have we learned from them and from the way how the first half a year of that war panned out? And how did you kind of, what do you think the current challenges that you are trying to overcome?
Well, I think the one thing that we can certainly say is that the Ukrainian vulnerabilities are not unique. There are vulnerabilities that exist in every digital infrastructure, and that's simply the way it is. Of course, trying to mitigate those vulnerabilities and address them is a different issue. And since the war started, there have been attacks in Moldova, in Georgia, in Montenegro, and Albania. There have been attacks in NATO allies as well that have been uncovered and quite significant as well. And there will continue to be these attacks. So no country is immune to such attacks. I wanted to reflect also a bit on what Marta was saying about data governance for different issues, but I think at the core of cybersecurity is data governance at this point. Before the war, I think that there were still some considerations that where you put your data is still a question. There are still those who think if you put it in a basement, if you lock the door, if you have your own staff watching that data, that it's the most safe. But that's simply not the case anymore. Those people are vulnerable. A small staff is vulnerable. People are only human. And so the question is this the choice that you want to have for your data? And more, as we see in the case of war, if you need resilience, you need to use cloud services and move your data, or at least have the ability to move that data. And if that data is processed globally for cybersecurity, you will have the highest standard of cybersecurity. Because I can just use the statistics for Microsoft, we have 8,500 security professionals working on data, on our global data, to make sure that data is secure. We process over 4 trillion signals daily to make sure that that data is secure, and we return what we learn from processing that data to every single user of our cloud.
How difficult will it be to actually try to breach that cloud data, and is that a new front in the cyber warfare?
There's always a risk of breach. You should always operate on the basis of how much can you risk, and there's always the opportunity of breach. To say that there's 100% cybersecurity in any case is just simply not true. We aim for that, but it's just not possible.
Do you know, have we seen any nation states trying those breaches of cloud data?
Certainly, and more and more. And I would say that those states who certainly attack others are used to attacking on-prem services. And this is where they have the most experience. But we don't have visibility about that. But we do see that as cloud becomes more used, attackers also become more familiar with it, unfortunately.
Jeffrey, we saw how Russia weaponized hacking, and they are one of those nation states that are probably trying to engage in cyber warfare much and much. Do you think the West and the Western security community has an adequate response?
I think they're building one. I think they're getting there. I think they're growing. I recall being at the White House in 2014 and during the presidential election. And this is something we really struggled with. There was something that the weaponization of intelligence that the Russians were using and information was something that we really hadn't dealt with very much before, and we really kind of struggled to respond. But I think that looking at the trajectory from then until now, at least within the US administration, I think there's much greater knowledge and tools in place to respond to those kinds of threats. But one thing I would add to, just kind of staying more in my lane of military analysis and information, the other part of the information part of this war that's very new that I think we need to take lessons from is how transparent it is, how much information is available. And I think the Russians found this very frustrating, that you have this whole army of people that are not actually government employees that are tracking the Russian military to a high degree of precision just on the internet because of publicly available information. And I think that's something that military planners, NATO, and everybody else needs to really think about, that if we get involved in a conflict, not only should you always plan for a breach, you should also almost always plan that your adversary is going to know where you are. Then it's going to be even harder to protect operational security in that kind of environment.
How much do you think, to what extent, if we can compare, now we know about the West providing a lot of hard weapons to Ukraine, how much assistance in this cybersecurity issues and in cyber warfare issues that the Western alliances and Western countries are now providing to Ukraine?
I imagine they're providing a lot, but also a lot of that because of operational security and national security is not purview to the public. Actually, my esteemed panelists might know more about that than I do. What I do know is that information in general. The Ukrainians have dominated the Russians in this sphere, I think, largely because of the information we've been giving them about the movements of Russian units. Not that
it's pretty much everybody saying that Ukrainians are able to watch the Russian moves pretty much in real time. In real time,
but also to project where Russian forces are going to be in the future. And that's where intelligence comes in, that the O centers on the internet can't predict as much. And I think, again, in 2014, we had a very difficult time sharing information with the Ukrainians and with the public because we just weren't used to it. And I think the big contrast between then and now is that we do have the tools in place. The intelligence community has come around to this idea about sharing information, and I think that's really made a huge difference.
Before we open the floor to questions, I would like to touch upon another very interesting topic. We're going forward, we don't know how this war will end, and hopefully the mayor of Riga just now said that we hope that Ukraine will win. But after that, following whatever the end will be, there will be a reconstruction of Ukraine. And there will be a lot of attention to infrastructure. So, Līga, how do you think how do you foresee that reconstruction and building more resilient infrastructure, how we need to approach that in Ukraine in the future?
Well, I think that we are working in the situation of a crisis now. So this is not a sustainable effort, certainly, that it can go on forever. So I think in the rebuilding of Ukraine, we have to take into consideration Ukraine might be one of the most forward-thinking examples of how they rebuild their national security once the war is over. And learning from what component the cyber warfare played in the national security, and what are the resources you need to maintain that national security in the digital space has to be taken into consideration. And how is a national budget set up? How is a defense budget set up? And to reformulate thoughts of where you put your resources to protect yourself adequately.
Okay. Marta, you were talking about various not only military sectors, but also the healthcare sector and agriculture. And how do you think, now we're talking about wartime and using various ways in using AI in wartime, in combat and military strategy, but how do you see that those resources and those tools and AI specifically can be used further on in reconstructing Ukraine and its infrastructure?
Oh, that's a very broad topic, I have to say. But first of all, we have to make sure, as I said before, that countries that already have that kind of tools, countries that already have, for example, Finland, which has one of the best healthcare services, and it's the best when it comes to digitalization and managing data and data governing, that they kind of provide Ukraine with certain good practices, because we have to make sure that right now this data that are there in Ukraine, in, for example, healthcare, as you mentioned, that they are recorded in a way that they later can be used, because this is very important. Because, for example, in Poland, it's very different, right? There are data that are saved properly in a proper format that they can be later read by AI, and they are in a very good quality. But there are also a lot of people, when they want to be fast, they just write something down, and then there is a lot of data that are just flowing, like they're just somewhere in nowhere, let's say. So first of all, good practices like other countries who have good way of doing that, taking care of Ukraine later, providing also with medtech, because as I mentioned before, medtech can kind of improve and make faster certain things, and it for sure will help. And then helping in building that kind of pilots, as I said, also as we are doing right now in Poland, and as we are going to do in European health data space. So that might also be a good idea to kind of, but maybe it's a little bit too idealistic for me right now to kind of put Ukraine into that project of European health data space, to give them to that kind of support them with our data, to maybe also help their medical devices to learn on that data, to have it more, to get faster, better, I would say. So this is for sure. And as you mentioned before, there's always a question of making it doing it securely. So for sure, some measures to do that will also have to be done.
Thanks, Marta. Jeffrey, we are talking about the future Ukraine, and obviously the damage to infrastructure is immense, and Russia is attacking infrastructure right now, pretty much as we speak, and that's their target now. In the future, how do you think we need to secure Ukraine digitally and technologically?
So I think one of the things that we really have to look at is, you're right, the Russians are just now attacking critical infrastructure as a way of trying to undermine Ukrainian morale for the most part, and to just basically break down their society. And I think going forward, the Ukrainians we need to give them the ability to predict that and protect those sites. This is one of the only areas, it's a little late in the game for the Russians. Normally they would have done this early on, and that's what we expected. They had this idea of different nodes in a society, and if you can target different nodes, you can kind of create a collapse. I think that's what they're trying to do now. And I think that understanding how they see that network and being able to protect that network is pretty critical.
As we in Europe now look at what's happening and look at that attack, Russian attack on infrastructure, should we be concerned here on this side of the border?
So I think we should. The problem that Russian military analysts historically face is that we're fighting two battles. One is the view that the Russian military is 10 feet tall, and the other one that is 2 feet tall. It's usually somewhere in between. And the problem coming out of this is that a lot of the assumptions are going to be that the Russian military is 2 feet tall. And that's probably not correct as well. And so understanding Russian military power going forward to include the digital and information aspect of that is going to be challenging. And so I do think it would be wrong for us to walk away from this and say, well, the Russians just can't do any of this, right? Again, a lot of the failures have been because how they were employed. If you really wanted to mess up your own military, it's really hard to do better than Putin did in the way that he employed the military. And so I think that we do need to be concerned, and we need to continue to focus on that and try to have at least a good calibrated understanding of what Russian combat power, I say combat power, national power, power in the information sphere, what that is going forward.
One question here, and I would like really then to address it to Līga, to you, Jeffrey, as well, is you know, we saw Russian army in action, you know, conventional army, and you know, is it 2 feet tall or 6 feet tall? You know, we'll see. What about Russia? Those cyber forces, either visible or invisible. What is our impression now? Are they 2 feet tall? Are they 6 feet tall? What is their potential to wreak cyber havoc in the West?
Yeah, sure.
We'll start with you,
so, I mean, I
Jeffrey.
think, again, part of the problem is that you can conduct cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, you can create this chaos, but unless it's paired with something, right, we're talking about multi-domain operations here, unless it's paired to a broader operational concept, I'm not sure what the point is, right? Because I think typically, I mean, especially...
Just all chaos?
So chaos, but it's a limited time frame, right? And so if you're going to do that against your adversary, you need to be able to take advantage of it, and the Russians simply have not been able to do that. And that's, I mean, they've lacked an overall cohesive concept across domains to do this, whether it's information, their air forces, their Navy. I mean, they just can't bring this thing together in a way that most of our militaries talk about doing now.
Līga, what's your view? What's the potential for Russians to wreak havoc, cyber havoc beyond Ukraine?
I think this is the million-dollar question. We've been asked to predict what the Russian capabilities are and what they'll do next, and I wish I could tell that, and then we could just mitigate it. But I think this is we all have to take an educated guess. We have all had the impression that the Russian capabilities have not all been used, and so we have to operate on that assumption that there could be more. And we have to be extremely vigilant on continuing the cooperation and working with governments and private sector to be able to mitigate all threats that arise, especially as they go up in sophistication. But they don't have to go up in sophistication at this point. It is really the lowest common denominator where the attack is happening. It's not sophisticated attacks that can cause the critical infrastructure damage and attacks that's necessary. It's bad cyber hygiene. It's people using bad passwords. It's not using multi-factor authentication. You don't need a sophisticated cyber attack.
But what sort of cooperation do you think is required now between EU, NATO, the United States, and also between the private sectors you are and the governments?
I think we have to continue to have a bit more systematic threat intelligence sharing, which is extremely difficult. There are... we talk to governments who do not want to talk to other parts of governments, but they talk to private sector willingly. So how do you get past that threshold of sharing that information that different governments have? We have to be able to have governments adopt technology in a way that's necessary. There are governments across Europe that are raising their military budgets and specifically addressing the attacks in Ukraine and how they need to address, from a budget perspective, technology. But it's extremely difficult in a very quick time to have the staff available, to have the capabilities to adopt those technologies. We can try to help with that, but you can only skill people so fast to get into the positions that are necessary. We have to definitely work on the next crisis while we're still in crisis. So how to have, the sharing platforms that are necessary, information flows that are necessary, the opportunity to have data flows as necessary in whichever crisis arises, whether it's a natural disaster or if it's war. So to have the opportunity and to work between NATO or the EU to match what is happening on the civilian side with the military side, to be able to take advantage of both, to have kind of seamless interaction when necessary.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor to questions. So if anybody has questions to any of our panelists, please raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself. And
hello, this is Shota Gvineria from the Baltic Defense College, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the military considerations of the cyberspace. We have been talking a lot about how cyberspace is important for the military operations per se before February 24. But are there any lessons now that we can already talk about how cyber considerations play an important role as the force enablers or the force multipliers, and specifically in which military components that has been more visible? Is it like target acquisition, ISTAR, or any other component of the warfare that we can already take away as the lessons? Thank you.
do you want to take that?
I could only reiterate the point that any cyber attacks are usually done in tandem with other disinformation attacks, influence operations, espionage, and kinetic attacks in the end. Trying to figure out how to map the connectivity between those different types of attacks will certainly benefit any military in going forward to understand that these things don't happen in silos. And that if you only address your cyber defense, you will be overlooking the possibilities of the combination of different attacks that will be the future of hybrid warfare.
In addition to Līga's great points, I think one thing we need to learn is that the Russians haven't been able to do this well, right, from the get-go. And so I think what we need to take away from that is the importance of having a strategy that's executed through good operational art that functions across domains, so you can bring this together into some kind of cohesive whole idea. You have to be able to fit the cyber domain in with conventional capabilities and your strategy and just your ability to manage information. If anything, what we've seen from the Russians is how not to do it. But it's also, it's hard to do, right? You can only talk about it so much before you have to actually get out there and do it and then see how it goes. And so you have to have this adaptability too, because we've talked a lot about it, but a lot has changed since the last time, at least for the United States and NATO, entered a conflict of this scale, right? And so it's not clear how we would do. I think we would do better than the Russians, but I think that there's a lot that we need to think about and take away from the mistakes that the Russians have made and just how difficult this is to do.
And actually, Jeffrey, do you think that is China watching what's happening in those mistakes that Russians are making and learning how to how to perform better than they did? I
do think they're watching. I think that they're wondering, like, okay, actually, what is our military capability? So there might be a moment of pause there, but also certainly watching to see what kind of mistakes the Russians made. I mean, for example, the initial air assault on the air base in the beginning days of the war wasn't coupled with anything else, and so they were wiped out by the Ukrainians. Things like that, or the lack of connection between the cyber attacks and anything that resulted in operational success. Right, there's just a complete divorce there because the Russians just haven't been able to operate at that scale. And so I think that's something they're definitely watching.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
I'm Ton Nguyen. I'm from Boston Global Forum. And we set up a global alliance for digital governance, for cybersecurity and AI governance also. We have question. We need alliance and ally and collaborate between big corporations as Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and to face and to face challenge from Russia, from China, and protect, maintain our democracy value. So, but big corporation, how we can collaborate? How to big text together. That is, we try to find out solution and to do that. So could you contribute your ideas first?
Līga, could you talk about?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's a lot of cooperation between industry that's not necessarily visible to the public. When it comes to threat intelligence, there's a lot of daily intelligence sharing between companies to identify threats for the benefit of all of our services, and that's not readily available. I think it was in 2017 we founded the Cybersecurity Tech Accord to get all companies who are interested in various aspects of cybersecurity to cooperate on more from the industry side. What can we do among industry? So we've been working a lot on issues such as how do we promote cybersecurity norms at the UN? How do we get companies to put forth, the multi-stakeholder view on what's important on stability in cyberspace? If we address companies thrive in more secure cyberspace. So it's definitely an objective that we share with several governments around the world, and if we can support those governments in finding ways to amplify those norms, that's another way. I think, I sit in Brussels, so we have, I would say, a very healthy environment of lobbyists that work together on different digital issues to give input onto legislation to make it make sense for industry, not only in our benefit, for the benefit of our users, for the benefits of the governments, and to make products more secure and do it in a way that makes sense and is implementable. So we do have lots of cooperation. We can certainly do more, and we're really ready for ideas, but I think that there's a lot of things that go on between industry that maybe we just don't advertise as much.
Yes, we hope can connect with you and Microsoft and Google. In Google we have Vincent. He is also very close with us and ready. So we will contact with you and Microsoft later.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would turn to Marta because we're also talking about a participation of various different countries in technologically secure in Ukraine. But there are a couple of questions. Questions are coming also online. They're anonymous though. But two questions that I would like probably to combine is, we're talking about managing data and data governance, and digital sovereignty that we touched upon with Marta. Does that mean the end of globalized digital business like finance? But at the same time, we see another question that digital warfare is contrasted by very decentralized data governance in the West. So should it be centralized? So this is data governance, which is decentralized. So does it mean that globalized digital business is under threat, or should it be centralized rather than decentralized? Marta, what do you think?
You touched so many points at the same time. It's very hard for me to address them all together. Maybe first on centralizing. In my opinion, it all depends, as I said, on the type of data, on the sector that we use, on the country as well. Because as we know, for example, for Ukraine in 2014, it was centralization that actually really helped. Centralization of data, obviously not making the databases near Kyiv or in Ukraine, as they right now they had the lesson, they moved some of the places they have the servers outside, as I mentioned before, but it really depends on the need that and why do we want to manage? Why do we want to collect certain data? What are the values or interests? Because values and the interests might be the same thing that we want to use it. I kind of don't understand the point of the question of decentralizing and the powers. Can you repeat that one? Because
yeah, so the question was that as we're talking about digital warfare now is that that digital warfare in whatever forms that they take are contrasted by a very decentralized data governance in the West. So should it be centralized instead?
Well, again, I think that my answer for that is it depends on. It really depends of the type, because if it's about typically data that might be used in a warfare, not like for civilians during the times of war, but on the warfare, so in the battlefield or for fighting, then maybe decentralization, it's a good idea, or maybe it should be like of decentralized forms, but also some kind controlled by one central, because it's important to have that body that give the access, that kind of rules, set the ground which rules should be governing the access, but also it's maybe sometimes safer it's on in different places and devices. So I know my answer is a very lawyer answer, so it really depends on the type, really.
What do you think, Līga?
I'm a bit more in favor of real rules-based order on data. Centralized, I don't think that you can centralize globally, certainly. But where you can centralize is EU can certainly centralize and is doing so very actively. There are, I wouldn't even count how many rules that govern data at this point. You have the AI Act, you have the Data Act, I work actively on the Cybersecurity Cloud certification that focuses on data and where it's based and where it came from and where it can move and all these kind of things. And for which kind of critical infrastructure you need what kind of certification. So there's very active data governance, and it's centralized in Brussels, certainly. In the end, I think it's up to who uses the data, who contributes their data. It needs to have choices and needs to understand where data goes and have more understanding about types of data, non-personal data, personal data, and what that kind of telemetry is necessary for cybersecurity, which isn't necessarily data. Data is a very wide word, so I could understand the lawyerly aspect because you can see how these things are defined in different acts and so on. So I think some centralization of general rules is very important. And educating the general public on these rules and how data flows, moves, and kind of debunking myths about data would be beneficial.
We still have a few minutes left, so if anybody has questions, please raise your hand.
I might maybe add some. Okay, somebody has a question.
Yeah, I will wait. But there was a very broad question that is almost of philosophical nature that I just saw came online. We're barely capable of governing the internet. Are we totally unprepared for what's coming for Web 3.0?
Oh, that's a good one.
Okay, can you? Yeah, do you want to answer, Marta?
I love ethical, philosophical questions, so I might try a little bit. I think it might be very controversial. I think we are not prepared for Web3 yet. I think this is just a buzzword right now, kind of, and maybe I see some points for blockchain, as I said, because it's very good for securing, for making sure who has an access to something regarding, for example, data governance, as I said. But, for example, if metaverse can be also in Web3, or we are talking only about Bitcoin or NFTs, I don't know. But I think that metaverse right now is just a kind of a concept that might be, important in some time. But right now it kind of make people more, how to say that? Make people more against each other, right? I mean, that there are some better people who can, who can have NFTs, who can have access to metaverse and stuff, and there are people who cannot. I see that as some type of new tool, some type of new entertainment. I see the point for entertainment, for metaverse, but for other reasons, I feel that it's too early, in my opinion. And that's a very good point, that if we still have some struggles with governing internet, I'm not exactly sure if we can start already thinking in Web3, because we always forget that we are in some kind of information bubble, that if in our environment, if in our countries, I don't know, internet is governed very well, or the digitalization of state and the services that are provided are very good condition, like, I don't know, Estonia, for example, of course. It doesn't mean that in another country in EU it's the same, or anywhere in the world. So I think there's still a lot to do, as this person mentioned.
Jeffrey, do you think that now the military and security services and counterintelligence services, they are really afraid that those particular tools and that Web3, be it metaverse, be it blockchain, be it other things, can actually be used by bad actors much better, and we may be having a hard time to sort of resist that?
I mean, I think there is concern. I mean, blockchain can be used for many different types of things, totally separate from things like crypto and things like that. I think there is concern on our side, and being a Russia guy, what I can tell you is the Russians have struggled with this as well. In digitization in general, they've identified a real problem in their own society. I don't like oversimplifications, but brain drain is a real thing in Russia. And through their laws that they've enacted on artificial intelligence and the digital economy and things like that, they're struggling with these technologies as well. And so I think that concern that we have on our side is on our adversary side as well. So I think it's just a very broad concern on how these different, the inherent transparency of blockchain and other things like that, how can that be employed in malicious ways? So I think that's definitely true.
Can it be employed not in malicious ways, but actually for the purposes of actually fighting cybercrime and fighting or protecting for cyber protection?
Yeah, I think I would defer to my fellow experts on that
what do you think, Līga?
About Web3, I'm not going to speculate at this point. I think I'm still in the learning phases, and I won't venture there. But I think with any technology that's up and coming, it's interesting to see how the EU and the NATO address it. I mean, there's a division in NATO called Emerging Security Challenges. It's not Emerging Security Opportunities, So it's very much looked at how these things threaten us and how dual-use technologies will be misused. So I would say that when looking from large institutions or governments, it's always looked at as a threat, and that's maybe not the best way forward. I think focusing more on the opportunities that are from new technologies should be also looked at, especially as these are the technologies that are going to drive economic opportunities.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panelists. I just hope that when we come here to Riga next year, we will be talking more about opportunities rather than challenges, but probably not. So thank you, Līga Rozentāle from Microsoft, Jeffrey Edmonds, U.S. National Security Strategist, and Marta Musidłowska from Warsaw at Instrat Foundation. Many thanks to everyone who attended that panel. I think it was fascinating but scary. So thank you very much. Thank you, and have a good evening.